Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. My entire life watching the news, there's been a lot of focus on what takes place in the Middle East. And naturally, when discussing what goes on in the Middle East, the subject of Islam comes up. As of now, I haven't had any guests on who could inform us about Islam, its history, or its creed, or its codes. So I decided to have somebody on. So today we're going to have on a professor in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Cornell University, David Stephen Powers. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So Muhammad was the prophet of Islam. Who was Muhammad and when did he write the Quran?
Okay. A good question. First, Muhammad did not write the Quran.
Oh, okay.
And I'll come to that. So Muhammad,
I learned something new already. That's great.
So Muhammad was born around the year 570 of the Common Era, and he died in the year 632. And he was a member of the tribe of Quraysh. He married a woman named Khadija. And in the year he was apparently a pious, contemplative, spiritual man who would go off on retreats for a month at a time. And in the year 610, he had an experience which he understood as being a revelation, direct revelation from God, which was transmitted to him through the angel Gabriel, who instructed him just to read or recite. Muhammad said, "I don't know what to read or recite." And Gabriel said, "Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a single clot of blood and taught him what he did not know." And that was the first revelation that Muhammad received. Over the course of the next 23 years, 610 to 632, Muhammad continued to receive revelations from God on a sort of ad hoc basis, often in response to specific things that were happening within his community. And we can come back to that, but he died in 632. During his lifetime, the revelations we're told were written down on whatever writing materials were available at that time. There was no paper, so they were written down on stones, bones, dried leaves, etc. And so when Muhammad died in 632, there was this collection of materials that had to be vetted and assembled into a text, and that activity took place over the next 25 years or so after his death. And by the year 661, the text that we know it as the Quran had been established. But 2 points here. It was Muhammad's followers who determined what would go into the text. But even more important, Muhammad is not the author of the Quran. He is merely, the Quran is, according to itself and according to Muslims, the word of God as revealed to Muhammad over the period of 23 years. So when we open up the text of the Quran, what we're seeing or reading or hearing are not Muhammad's ideas, but rather God's ideas.
So do we know, well, I don't know, but you may know, is the Quran everything that was claimed to be revealed to Muhammad? And could there be anything in there that wasn't? Like, I just have the Catholic Church in mind as they're assembling the New Testament, and they're excluding some things. They're deciding what goes in there. Is it similar, or was all the material that he had transcribed gathered and put into the Quran?
Well, that's a very good question. Not an easy one to answer. But if we begin with the Hebrew Bible, it took a long time for the Hebrew Bible to take its canonical form, perhaps even 1,000 years. We move to the New Testament. It took a century before the four books of the New Testament were put together and assembled. And then when we move to Islam, as I just mentioned, the text of the Quran, according to Islamic tradition, was put together within a generation after his death. So there was a much shorter period of time between the compilation of the Quran than either the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible. According to Muslims, everything that is in the Quran was a revelation received to Muhammad, and nothing was added to the Quran after Muhammad died. According to Western scholars, the situation is a little more complex, or is more complex. Well, according to Western scholars, it's possible that either words or verses or phrases or sentences were either modified or added after Muhammad died. I say it's possible because we have very little proof. That is, Western scholars have very little proof that this in fact took place. But the proof that we do have are these early Quran manuscripts, which you can see signs of erasures, for example, where things are rewritten. Also, if you open the text of the Quran as we have it today, you can go to a particular chapter and something seems to be out of place. You'll have a poetic a chapter of the Quran, which is all poetry, and in the middle of it, there's this long instruction in prose, which just doesn't seem to fit. And even the tweaking of one word can change the meaning of the text. And so Western scholars have devoted a lot of attention to trying to answer your question, but no one's been able to prove definitively that X, Y, or Z was added to the Quran after Muhammad's death.
Yeah, I've had a lot of debates with Muslims and discussions with Muslims, and they tell me that in the Quran, there's examples where it reveals things that only came to be known to modern science very recently. Now, I've read the Quran and I don't see that, but I didn't read it in Arabic. So,
Yeah.
and my retort is always, well, if it's revealing science in the 600s, then why did it take till the 20th century for anybody to figure this out? It's easy in retrospect, in other words, to look back at something and come up with a justification and say this means this. But I could be, of course, wrong, and you're an expert. So is it true?
Well, let me begin by saying that the Quran has an interesting position on science.
Okay.
We tend to think of science and religion as being at the opposite extremes. But there are a number of verses in the Quran that talk about the world and the cosmos, the sun, the moon, the stars, the reproduction cycles, everything. And in these verses, God tells Muhammad that if you pay attention to physics, if you pay attention to the world and to physics and to cosmology and to, he doesn't use those words, but you pay attention to the world and how it works, the universe and how it works, you will come closer to the idea that there must be a creator. And for that reason, in large part, I think, Islam has always encouraged scientific activity. And so if we skip ahead to the 800s, 900s, 1000s, I mean, Muslims made major contributions in astronomy, astrology, mathematics, medicine, zoology, etc. So Muslim civilization has made many achievements in scientific discovery. I think that your friend or the people that you're talking to are engaging in what might be called eisegesis, which is reading the present into the text, reading what we want to read back into the text where it's not there explicitly. But I would qualify that statement by saying that, I mean, for example, the Quran talks about human reproduction. I believe it's in chapter 22 of the Quran, which is called, its title of which is Pilgrimage. It talks about human production. Verily, we created you from a single clot of blood. And then it talks about the maturation process of what we would call the embryo. And it would, and it traces that maturation process in a way that resembles what we know today about how a fetus develops at a time when other cultures did not have this understanding of how the fetus develops. So I'd, you know, you know, your friend or the people you're talking to about this, there's can point to a couple of examples of things where the Quran has a remarkable awareness of what we would call certain biology and scientific activity, but most of, but you know, most of what the Quran didn't have an explanation for, you know, the creation of the world, or for space exploration, or for, you know, all kind, you know, whatever. 20th century scientific achievements are not mentioned specifically in the Quran, and for the most part are not even alluded to or suggested.
Okay, you mentioned the Islamic influence on science, and I want to get to that, but I want to go back to the beginning of Islam
Yeah,
first.
yeah.
Now, from what I understand, in the beginning, Islam was a very warring religion. First of all, is that true? Is that accurate? Did they engage in warfare? And if so, why? What were the causes of the wars, for instance, that Muhammad engaged in?
Let me take you back even a little bit further,
Okay.
and let's talk about what's the relationship between Judaism and Christianity on the one hand, and Islam on the other. And when I'm teaching Introduction to Islamic Civilization, I tell my students that the answer to that question can be reduced to 3 letters of our alphabet. And those 3 letters are C, C, and C. 3 C's. First letter means confirm, the second means correct, and the third means complete. So the Quran says explicitly on many occasions that the revelations that God is sending to Muhammad confirm the revelations that were sent previously to Moses and to Jesus. And so the Quran presents itself as a direct continuation of both Judaism and Christianity. And I think that's very important. I mean, Muslims understand that, but non-Muslims don't understand that. Non-Muslims think, oh, Islam, that's some other religion over there. You know, I'm Jewish, I'm Christian, whatever. We're very different. But the Quran, that's not how the Quran portrays itself. It's a direct continuation of Judaism and Christianity. And it recognizes that earlier Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon, Jesus, it recognizes many, many figures who appear in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament as prophets, true prophets. So Jesus is a true prophet, just like Muhammad. Moses was a true prophet, just like Muhammad. So the first C is to confirm. The second C is to correct. The Quran indicates that for whatever reason, the Jews and the Christians were unable to preserve the revelations that they received, that Moses and Jesus received, exactly as those revelations had been sent down to them. Errors entered into the text. So, for example, according to the New Testament, Jesus is the Son of God. That's an error. Jesus wasn't the Son of God. He was just a man. He was a prophet, but he was not the Son of God. So the Quran corrects that error. And so whatever it refers to Jesus, it's Jesus, the son of Mary. And there's no reference to him being the Son of God. And it says, the Quran says, God is one. He doesn't give birth to anyone, and he is not born. Lam yalid wa lam yulad. So the Quran confirms the earlier scriptures. It corrects them where needed, and I could give you more examples of that. And then the third C is complete. It completes the process of communication between God and mankind, which began with the first prophet, Adam, and then continued through this series of prophets, the 20 or so prophets, that culminates with Muhammad, who is not just another prophet, but also in Arabic, the Arabic term is Khatam an-Nabiyyin. He's also the seal of prophets, which Muslims understand as meaning he's the last prophet. He brings the phenomenon of prophecy to an end, completes the phenomenon of prophecy. So now we have the final version of God's blueprint for mankind. And now to try to get to your question, Muslims regard it as an obligation. The Quran suggests it's an obligation of Muslims to bring this message to everybody else in the world. That might be to Jews, to Christians, to pagans, to polytheists, or whatever. But it's the obligation of Muslims to bring this message to everyone in the world. Now, during the first 10 years in which Muhammad received revelation, from 610 to there's 12 years, 610 to 622, he lived in his hometown of Mecca, and he attracted a small number of followers. He tried to persuade the pagans and polytheists of Mecca to come over to join his movement. He was not successful. The chapters, the revelations that were sent down to Muhammad in Mecca mostly deal with theological matters, oneness of God, heaven and hell, reward and punishment. In 622, Muhammad instructed his followers to make the hijrah, the migration from Mecca to Medina. And so he'll spend, and this 622 is the first year of the Muslim calendar, the Hijri calendar. And from 620, so for the next 10 years, Muhammad was in Medina, where he became a political figure. He became the leader of the city of Medina. One of the first things that he did when he arrived in Medina was to draft a document which is known as the Covenant of Medina, which was a document with the emigrants who had come with him, and with the inhabitants of Medina who joined the community, and with the Jews. There was a large number of Jews in Medina, and many of these Jewish tribes then were signatories to this document. And in this document, the document says that the Jews are part of the community, just like the different Muslim groups. And this document lays out the obligations of the community in war and peace, which now gets to your question. That is, yes, Muhammad in Medina was not only a political leader, but he was also a military leader. He was the commander of armies, of military expeditions. He fought himself in a series of military encounters with the pagans and polytheists of Mecca. He appointed commanders to go into what's today Palestine, Israel, southern Jordan, to engage with Byzantine armies in southern Jordan. He himself traveled to a place called Tabuk, which is sort of northern Saudi Arabia, southern Israel. And so here the general point I think that needs to be made is that, again, if you compare Islam versus Judaism and Christianity. Judaism begins with Abraham. 1,000 years will pass before you have a Jewish state with Saul as the king, and then David and Solomon. So Judaism develops outside of politics. Eventually, it becomes political, and eventually, the first and the second temples are destroyed, and Judaism is deracinated politically. I mean, it's not political, becomes apolitical until the 20th century. Christianity, Christ was not a political figure. He was not a political leader. He didn't lead any armies. He was persecuted. And 300 or more years passed before Constantine became a Christian in the Byzantine Empire, and another generation passed until Christianity became the official religion of the Byzantine Empire. Muhammad was a successful politician within his own lifetime. Through military means and through diplomatic negotiations, he was able, for the first time in history, to unite what we call the Arabian Peninsula into a single polity, a state. This polity was referred to as an ummah. It's a religio-political polity. There's no separation between religion and politics in the Quran or in classical Islam. So Muhammad dies in 632. He's created this. He's helped to produce this text that we know as the Quran. He has this a substantial community of followers, including many Bedouin tribesmen, many Bedouin tribesmen from Arabia who have joined the community of believers. And when he dies in 632, his followers see it as their obligation to spread this word, to spread his message to the rest of the world. In the Quran, God, the audience of the Quran is not the Arabs. The audience of the Quran is not specifically the Muslims even. The Quran says, "O mankind." That is, God, in the Quran, God speaking, he speaks to the whole world. And this message is for the whole world. So now you have this community which is expanding. It has an ideology. So the community is expanding, and it has an ideology that relates to warfare, which is, again, getting us back to your question. And let me say something about this ideology. The Quran talks about jihad fi sabilillah. And the word jihad simply means struggle. It does not mean holy war. It means struggle, but jihad fi sabilillah means struggle in the path of God. And the Quran has other words for struggling in the path of God, including fighting and killing. There's hundreds of verses in the Quran that talk about how you should go about engaging in military activity against unbelievers. There are two verses in particular that address military action against unbelievers. One of them says, fight the unbelievers. It's in chapter 9 of the Quran. Fight the unbelievers, lay an ambush, well, can I get you the verse?
Go ahead, sure.
Says, then when the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them, and take them and confine them, and lie in wait for them at every place of ambush. But until they repent and pray and pay the alms tax. And if they do that, you're supposed to release them. So this verse, instructs the Muslims that they should fight against unbelievers and polytheists. These are not Jews or Christians. These are pagans or polytheists. And the Muslims have a duty to fight against pagans and polytheists. And it talks about lying in ambush and killing them. But there's a limit that it places on military activity against unbelievers. Once they, it says, pray and pay the alms tax. That is to say, if they join your community, then you must cease and desist, and they become one of you. They become members of your group with no, difference between them and between them and you. So one might say that the Quran is radically intolerant of polytheism, of paganism and polytheism. That's one verse. The second verse deals not with pagans and polytheists, but with Jews and Christians. And it says, fight from among the people who have been given the scripture, those who do not believe in God in the last day. So these are Jews and Christians who apparently don't believe in the last day. I mean, I don't know about the God, but they don't believe in the last day. And who do not forbid that which God and his messenger have forbidden. And who do not follow the religion of truth. So there were Jews and Christians who joined the Muslim community in Mecca and Medina. But there were also Jews and Christians who didn't join. And this verse seems to be referring to those, and who not only didn't join during Muhammad's lifetime, but also chose not to join after he died. And you're supposed to fight them until they pay the tribute out of hand, in a state of humiliation, perhaps. And so here, so in this verse, which establishes the policies that Muslims should have against Jews and Christians, and in this case, they're not required to join the Muslim community, as the pagans and polytheists are. In this case, you cease and desist military action against them once they accept your political supremacy, and they, as manifested by the payment of a poll tax, which came to be 1, 2, or 4 gold coins, depending on your wealth. And after Muhammad's death, as the conquest, which we'll talk about, unfolded, Jews and Christians became subject members of this new Muslim polity, and they were required to pay this special poll tax on an annual basis, 1, 2, or 4 gold coins. And by paying that poll tax, they established a contractual relationship with the leader of the Muslim community at that time, the Caliph, in return for the payment of the poll tax, it was his job, his responsibility to protect the Jews and the Christians from any attacks on them. And so Jews and Christians became, you might say, second class. They became protected people within the Muslim state.
Professor, that sounds like a bit of a euphemism to me. Because to call them protected people, what you're saying is, as long as they're willing to live in subordination to the Muslim leaders, they'll be safe.
Correct. That is, there's a hierarchy here. Islam is God's final statement to mankind. Islam is the complete version of God's revelation. Jews and Christians are on the path to getting there, but they've strayed from the path. They have, certain ideas have entered into their religions which weren't there originally. And so if they want to maintain those ideas, they can, but they maintain them as in a position of subordination. Now it's interesting, and so Jews and Christians, Muslims. I mean, initially, 75% of the 90% of the people living in the initial first Muslim states were Jews and Christians. The Muslims were a small minority, but they had political and military power. Over time, that over hundreds of years, eventually, the Muslims constituted 75%, 80%, 90% of the population of the Middle East, and the minorities decreased. I may have exaggerated those numbers. But Jews and Christians, so Jews and Christians adopted Arabic as their spoken language. And as protected people, they were allowed to practice their religion freely. They were allowed to own land. They were allowed to engage in commerce. They were sort of an autonomous group in Muslim society. No, they could not be in a position of leadership. No, they could not fight in the military. They couldn't be in a position of power by being in the military. But they had this sort of they occupied this autonomous zone within Muslim civilization, and they were integrated into Muslim civilization in a remarkable way, which we can talk about if you want. But what the point here is, I think what's important here is, we're talking about the years 600, 700, 800. Muslim society created a space for people who were different, non-Muslims, non-Muslim monotheists. They created a space for non-Muslim monotheists. There were restrictions placed on them, but apart from those restrictions, they had this remarkable amount of autonomy. This was not the case, for example, in Europe at the same time. In Europe, if we move ahead to Spain and the 1400s, we get the Inquisition. You had, if you were not, there was no space for the other in Catholic Spain.
Right.
And so you had to convert to Catholicism, or you had to leave, or whatever.
Yeah, they kicked the Jews and the Muslims out at the same time, right, in 1492. Right. What about, Professor, the famous line in the Quran that speaks of Jews and says they have become, like, well, depending on your translation, apes and swine, or monkeys and pigs, or some such thing?
Right. Yeah, that's a tough one, but I would begin answering that question by saying that the Quran demonstrates a remarkable familiarity with earlier Jewish and Christian texts, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and also Talmudic texts, that is, post-biblical texts. And in that particular instance, and I don't know this point specifically, but other scholars have examined that point, and they have established, I think, that the Quran may be sort of parroting and modifying a statement that's made in a Jewish Talmudic text. That doesn't help. I mean, it's still an awful thing to say. What I'm suggesting is that the Quran is sort of engaging in a polemic with Jews and using language that the Jews of that time might have been familiar with, okay. And that was the point of that. That particular reference was part of this polemic against Judaism, but it's still a very troubling reference.
Sure. Now, you mentioned that this is, the 6, 7, and 800s, and certainly one can go through the Bible and find all kinds of horrendous quotes about stoning people for working on the Sabbath, killing people for this or that. So this is not unique to Islam, but this in the 6, 7, and 800s, this ideology may have created a safe space. But if in the 20th and the 21st century, somebody reads this text and takes it literally to apply it today, we could have a lot of problems, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So, and to add to that, as I said, the Quran is the literal word for Muslims. The Quran is the literal word of God, and it's unchangeable. Even if I mean, so Muslims. So there are a number of statements in the Quran that a 21st century Muslim might find objectionable. For example, the Quran acknowledges slavery as a integral part of Muhammad's society. Muhammad himself was a slave owner. He purchased a slave named Zaid. Actually, his wife helped him to purchase Zaid. He eventually gave Zaid, he eventually manumitted, freed Zaid, and adopted him as his son. But he himself was a slave owner. Other members of the Muslim community were slave owners. The Quran, acknowledges, the Quran encourages Muslims to treat their slaves well. It encourages Muslims to manumit slaves when they die. But it doesn't say you should abolish slavery, nor did Muhammad say that in any statement that he made outside of the Quran. And so, Muslim society from the year 800 to the year 1800 was a slave-owning society. Sure. There was even a dynasty called of slaves or former slaves that controlled Egypt from 1250 to 1517, the so-called Mamluks. They all started their careers in the Muslim world as slaves who were freed and trained, and they rose to positions of supreme power. But what is a Muslim in the 21st century who doesn't think slavery is a good thing do about the fact that the Quran acknowledges this institution? You just can't say, we're going to abrogate that verse, or we're going to,
right.
The best that one can do is to sort of say, I'm going to bracket that verse. I'm going to put it over here, and I'm just not going to deal with it. But technically, there's no way, from a religious perspective, to abolish slavery in a Muslim society. You can abolish the slave trade. You can say, okay, you can't buy and sell trade, and that would have might have the consequences that you're interested in. But you can't say slavery is abolished, because God acknowledged slavery, and it was, part of His revelation to Muhammad.
Okay.
So this is an example of something that one finds in the Quran, and if one takes it literally, so if a Muslim could take the Quran literally and acquire a slave today in the 21st century and say, this is part of my religion.
Now, you did mention the science, and there are some contributions to science. So what I want to talk about specifically, and I've got about 10, 15 minutes left. The Muslim community in Spain, I think they go by the name the Saracens, if I'm not mistaken.
That's not the name they give themselves.
Somebody gave them that name, though, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, how did they get to Spain, and what type of communities did they have? How long were they in Spain? What type of communities did they have in Spain?
Well, the Muslims arrive in Spain in the year 711. That is 80 years or so after Muhammad dies. If we go back, Muhammad dies, and Muslim armies then enter Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and they fan out in easterly direction into Iran. They reach Central Asia, and in a westerly direction, they cross Egypt, North Africa, Morocco, and they establish their dominance in all of those regions. In 711, Muslim armies cross over what we call the Strait of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula. Spain did not exist at that time. And they continued, and they defeated the Vandals, who were the tribal groups that were in control of the Iberian Peninsula. They penetrated as far as southern France, and in 732, they were defeated by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours or Poitiers. and that marks the limit of expansion in the west, 732 Poitiers, and 711. By 711 in the east, they had reached the Indus River and also Central Asia, and they created through military conquest. They had created an empire that stretched from southern France to the Indus River and Central Asia. Muslims migrated into, and the Muslims called the Iberian Peninsula Al-Andalus, which is a deformation of the word vandal. There's no V in Arabic, so vandal becomes Andal. Al-Andalus is, so it was a combination of Arabs who entered Spain, who moved to Spain, who emigrated to Spain from the Middle East, but also people, Jews and Christians, joined the Muslim community in Spain, became Muslims, and they created a remarkable civilization in Al-Andalus, which, if you've gone to Granada, you've seen the Alhambra. If you've gone to Cordoba, you may have seen statues of famous Muslim philosophers. So philosophical activity and scientific activity were pursued there. And Europeans came not just to Spain, but to the Muslim world to get knowledge, to acquire knowledge. Muslims were the source of knowledge at that time. People came to Baghdad and Cairo and other cities to acquire knowledge from the Muslims.
Okay, so what are some of the philosophies, for instance, that you're taking? Like, I think I'm going to butcher the name probably, but Avicenna or Avicenna, he's a famous Muslim philosopher. What are some of the things that are being taught that are contributing ultimately to civilization?
So let's go back to around the foundation. Baghdad, the city of Baghdad was created in the 800s, early 800s. And this was a cosmopolitan city with Jews, Christians, Muslims, also pagans and polytheists. People spoke many languages. By this time, Arabic had been declared to be the official language of the Muslim state. And Arabic was adopted by people living from Spain to the Indus River. Arabic became the language of everyday speech among Muslims, Jews, and Christians. The Muslim leaders and Islam is Muhammad's the last prophet, and Muslim civilization, Muslim society, Muslims regarded their society as the culmination of all of the social and cultural and scientific developments that had accumulated before they came on the scene. And so there's a Muslim caliph who established what's called House of Wisdom.
What does caliph mean?
Caliph is when Muhammad was the last prophet, when he died, Muslims had to make a decision about who would become the leader of the community.
Okay.
He couldn't be a prophet. They created a new institution for leadership called Caliph. Is Khalifa, the successor to the messenger of God.
Okay.
And so the Caliph is the leader of the Muslim community after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Prophecy ends, and you get caliphs as the religious and political leaders of the community. So this caliph in Baghdad established the House of Wisdom, and he invited men who spoke many languages and who could read and write many languages to come to this institution, and they systematically began to translate. This process takes place over 100 years or more. They systematically translate almost everything, any text that they could get their hands on, whether it's from Byzantium or from India or from Persia or from wherever. And so they began with astrological texts, and then they moved on to astronomical texts, and then they moved on to Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus and then onto mathematical texts, Euclid and Euripides, and medical texts, Galen, and the list goes on and on and on. And so they all of this knowledge that had been produced both in the East and the West, or much of this knowledge that had been produced in the East and the West prior to the year 600, now is translated into Arabic and becomes part of the Arabic humanities and part of the Arabic educational system, and not the Arab, the Muslim humanities and the Muslim educational system. And it was not just Muslims who studied these texts, it was Jews and Christians who spoke Arabic and Muslims who were Arabic speaking. All of them, they were involved in the translation, and they were involved in the transmission and in the development. So Ibn Rushd is a famous philosopher in Cordoba who wrote a commentary on Aristotle. For the first, from 800 until about the year 1100, philosophy was focused on Aristotle, and Muslim philosophers wrote commentaries on Aristotle, one after the other, until Avicenna, you mentioned, he broke from the Aristotelian tradition and developed his own sort of philosophical system, which dominated in the Muslim world from the time of his death around the year 1000 down to the present time. But Ibn Sina, Avicenna, was not just a philosopher, he was also a physician who wrote a massive 5-volume compendium of medicine called the Qanun. And most of these texts spread throughout the Muslim world. Many of them made their way to Cordoba in southern Spain. So philosophical, medical, mathematical. And in the 11th century, the Christian kingdoms of we call northern Spain, began to push south and to conquer and to seize Muslim territory and to establish Christian sovereignty in that territory. And in 1085, they conquered Toledo, which had a significant Jewish population in addition to the Muslim population. And after 1085, Toledo becomes a part of the Christian state, but these Jews and Muslims who speak many languages, including Latin, now translate Aristotle and the commentaries on Aristotle and Avicenna's canon of medicine and other texts into Latin. And now the Latin texts then are rediscovered. That is, this is the beginning of the Renaissance. This is the mechanism by which Europe rediscovered its classical, humanistic, Hellenistic roots, which had been forgotten. So one might say that the Muslims sort of saved Western civilization for the West.
Okay, now it's amazing to me because nowadays you don't really, well, I don't, and I don't think most people do, think of Muslim countries as advanced civilizations, as intellectual sort of safe spaces or areas for intellectual growth. And I'm just wondering, and I don't know if you know or not, but you mentioned that Aristotle dominated the Muslim communities up until I think you said 1100.
Right, philosophy.
And that's when Avicenna, sort of his philosophy took over and held sway up until the present time.
Right.
How much of their sort of intellectual stultification can be, do you think, if it can, attributed to that? Because Aristotle, you're talking about focus on logic, observation, intellectual growth. And I'm under the opinion that Aristotle is in large part responsible for the Renaissance, for the Enlightenment, and the sort of the scientific revolution. I just wonder how much going away from Aristotle has stunted the growth, the intellectual growth of Islamic communities.
I don't think it was the break from Aristotle, because Avicenna was a very progressive thinker himself.
Okay.
Um, I think there are other causes for the phenomenon that you're pointing to. Um, and I also wouldn't use the word stultificate. Well, stultification possibly, but the question is, why did the Muslim community continue? Why did the level of intellectual activity in the Muslim community, why did the level of intellectual activity in the Muslim community continue more or less at a level of stasis when in the West you have this
Yes.
sharp increase, with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and, everything, and the explosion of knowledge that takes place. And I would answer that question by suggesting that it has something to do with the age of exploration and the discovery of a route to India that goes around Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and also of the discovery of the Americas. But the discovery of the route around Africa was important, because it meant that the Europeans, whether the Portuguese or the Spanish or the whoever, who wanted access to trade in India and China, no longer had to go through Cairo or Baghdad or the Muslim world in order to get to where they wanted to go. And this meant that, and at the same time, the discovery of America meant that huge sums of silver, I guess, and maybe gold, but silver, gold and silver. Europeans got access to these resources, which previously they got from sub-Saharan Africa. Again, you had to go through the Muslim world in order to get down to sub-Saharan Africa to get gold. And so beginning around the year 1500, the economy of the Muslim world went into decline, although it went into a decline. And this meant that there was less money available to patronize the humanities and the arts. And that, I think, is what caused the Muslim world to sort of remain more or less at the same level while Europe, knowledge in Europe exploded. But I would also challenge the idea that science in the Muslim world remained at this level of stasis, because if you start looking closely at different areas, you see that Muslim scientists in the Muslim world are continuing to make discoveries even into the 1500s and the 1600s and the 1700s, and that some of these discoveries are actually still are having an influence on Europe. So, for example, there's a very famous Muslim scientist named Tusi. He actually lived in the 1200s. And he was both a mathematician and an astronomer. The Mongols built an observatory, a very large observatory for him. And he is describing the motion of the heavenly bodies, produced something that's known as the Tusi couple. It's just a diagram or an image of how the one heavenly body moves around the other. You go to Copernicus, his De Revolutionibus, on the revolution of the heavenly bodies, you will find a diagram that is identical to the diagram in Tusi's text that was written several hundred years earlier. And it's clear that there's some sort of indirect connection there. It's not direct, because Galileo didn't read Arabic, or Copernicus didn't read Arabic, but Tusi's text would have been translated into into Greek or into one another European language, and through it, Copernicus would have gotten access to it. And similarly, Dante's Divine Comedy manifests all kinds of similarities to texts that were written in the Muslim world about Muhammad's nightly ascent to Jerusalem, where he goes through the seven heavens. and also into hell. So you have an ascent through heaven and a descent to hell. Again, Europe, knowledge was transferred from the Muslim world into Europe before the Age of Discovery, but it continued to be transferred after the Age of Discovery.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor, for a fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it. Professor David Stephen Powers, where can people find you? Do you have a website or a blog or anything where people can go?
I don't have a blog, but I suppose if you Google me at Cornell, you'll come up to my Cornell web page.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank
For
you.
now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Remember, give me your remarks. Let me know what you think. Till next time.